You know, this is a conference in honor of Adrien, but circumstances force me to start with Sven. Because Sven told us some minutes ago that the EU should become more like the United States. And many people in Europe have thought that way for the past 60 years. And that the EU doesn't look like the US is not for lack of trying. So we have tried to become like the US. The tragedy is just the more we try, the less the EU looks like the US. And it's that, you know, puzzle that I try to address in this talk. Now, you know, the talk is called Integration, European Integration of Core State Powers, so I first talked about what this is supposed to be. Then I look at the level of integration of core state powers, the patterns of integration, and I think I skipped the last part. Now, what are core state powers? This is, of course, a question to get philosophical about. Why not start with Stefano's, you know, path-breaking book and see what pages 60 to 64 tell us? And they tell us at the very beginning, the European state was about coercion, it was about money, and it was about public administration. And this is why we decided to treat these triads of powers as the core powers of the state. You know, it's very hard to be considered a state if you don't have that. The research question is simply if, how, and why the EU is involved in these core state powers. And the approach was to simply invite smart people to do 3 sets of case studies on military, fiscal, and administrative integration. Now, as Ulrich Krotz reminded us helpfully yesterday, there are only 2 useful social scientists in Europe. One is Max Weber, the other is Adrien Héritier. Of course, we tried to get both of them, but Max Weber didn't answer to our emails. This is why we were all the more happy that we could get Adrien on board. Now, the rest of my talk is really a summary of what these people told us. First, let's start with the level of integration. You know, and a good starting point is to look simply at the treaty-based mandate of the EU and core state powers, and as it's well known, starting with Maastricht, the EU has a mandate in common foreign and security policy, there's monetary union, there are justice and home affairs. So somehow that belongs to the turf of the EU. But what does that mean? You know, what are the decision rules in these fields? And Tanja Börzel has helpfully collected data on this, which later on was taken over by Frank Schimmelpfennig and others. And what this data does is it roughly codes how supranational decision-making is in a field. And the blue line is core state powers, and the red line is market integration. And don't ask me, you can ask me for the details. Of course, they are rather boring. Just let's look at the trend. Of course, as we would expect, decision-making in core state powers is less supranational as in market integration. What is much more striking is that both lines increase in parallel. So decision-making in core state powers on average is now as supranational as in market integration after Maastricht. But, you know, this is just formal authority, and you don't have to use it. So let's take a closer look at what the EU actually did in core state powers. Now, there are two ways in which the EU can get involved in core state powers. One is capacity building for European core state powers, for the European exercise of core state powers. And the second way is devising European regulation for the national exercise of core state powers. Now, let's run through these categories. And of course, you know, if you look at capacity, at the first look, there isn't much. There is no European army, there's no European tax, the administrative infrastructure is minimal. On a second more closer look, there's a little more than meets the eye. So in the military field, there's a minimal command and control infrastructure, and there are military missions. In the fiscal field, you know, the budget is small and has actually shrunken in size from 1.2% of gross national income in the late 1990s to hardly 1% of gross national income today. But, you know, in the wake of the crisis, there were all these emergency funds, so we have the permanent European stability mechanism, and we are about to have the single bank resolution fund. You know, you may consider that not enough and too late and in the wrong form, but, you know, definitely some capacity has been created. Finally, on public administration, you know, the Commission likes to talk down the figure of public officials working for the EU. So in the Commission, there are around about 24,000 people working for the EU. But outside the Commission, there are almost 30,000 people. So the administration of the European Parliament has increased, the administration of the Council Secretariat has increased, there is the European Central Bank, there are lots of regulatory agencies nowadays. So counting all this together, some observers come to the figure of 55,000 people. Now, however you look at the issue, you have to come to the conclusion that the capacity of the EU in core state powers is extremely weak by any comparison. Compared to Switzerland, a very, very decentralized federation, the federal government in Switzerland has much more power, resources at its disposal than the EU. Now, the point is that the EU partly compensates or tries to compensate for its lack of capacities by regulation. So it tries to use regulation to mobilize national resources for European purposes. This is what Eva has described in her chapter on administrative integration. And that's also the pattern in the military field, perhaps not very successfully, but the point of regulations like the headline goals, the battle group concept, is to nudge European member states into developing force structures that the EU, or NATO for that matter, can draw on in order to stage military missions. And in the fiscal field, of course, EU regulations serve to constrain national fiscal policy to an extent that the creation of European fiscal capacity becomes redundant. So since the European Union cannot tax and spend in the same way that the US federal government can tax and spend and thereby compensate for regional disparities. The EU tries to use rules to prevent the development of fiscal disparities in the first place. Does all this matter? Well, of course, you know, this is a question for lots of half glass full, half glass empty comparison. What is important to keep in mind is, you know, it's a normal activity for the EU to be involved in these three core state powers, and it often makes a difference. So in the fiscal field, that's very obvious. In the administrative field, that's less obvious, but apparently very consequential. In the military field, that is not so entirely clear. Is this involvement a good thing? You know, in brackets for Sven, the answer seems to be it depends. Every time, you know, core state powers are also handled decentrally in states, like in public administration and policing. The European system of regulating national core state powers seems to work fairly well. The problem is in fields like military security or fiscal policy, where at least at certain moments of crisis, you know, you need to mobilize a lot of power very quickly. And then this system of a regulatory integration of core state powers reaches its limits. Now, you know, what are the patterns? You know, if you look at the ideal, typical process of historical state formation, the centralization of core state powers at the national level goes together, is associated with territorial consolidation, institutional centralization, and political unification. In the EU, by contrast, the intervention of the EU in core state powers is associated with territorial differentiation, institutional fragmentation, and political segmentation. Very briefly, territorial differentiation. You know, the concept of differentiated integration was invented in order to get into core state powers. So in market integration, you have hardly any differentiated integration at all, but differentiated integration is a constituent feature of European interventions in core state powers. And you know, the anecdotal evidence from the case studies suggests that differentiation is higher when it comes to capacity building than when it comes to regulation. So in the military field, all the regulations that you have for defense market integration or national force planning apply to 27 or 28 member states, but only 20 member states on average are involved in military missions. In the fiscal field, emergency funds like the ESM, the Single Bank Resolution Fund, are limited to 18 member states, while the regulatory frameworks into which they are embedded usually apply to all member states. Last point on territorial differentiation, it's non-uniform. It's not that always the same member states opt out all policies and core state powers, but you know, it's a shifting patterns of variable geometry, so there isn't, you know, territorial retrenchment, the consolidation of a core group of member states, and a lesser integration of peripheral states, but you know, it's that the external borders of the EU get diffused because of the integration of core state powers. Institutional fragmentation, you know, associated with the move into core state powers, you have a proliferation of new bodies, new intergovernmental bodies like the European Council above the Council of Ministers, the Eurogroup next to the Council of Ministers, the Political and Security Committee, I think it's called, below the Council of Ministers. You know, the Council loses focality. New supranational bodies. You know, you have the ECB, you have the presidents of the new president of the European Council, you have the High Representative, and of course you have a proliferation of EU executive and regulatory agencies. So to the extent that the EU acquires core state powers at all, builds capacity, this capacity is not built within the core institutional framework of the EU, but outside it. And the result is fragmentation. So if the EU goes to the G20 summit in Brisbane, it brings 2 presidents. If it goes to collect the Nobel Prize, it brings 3 presidents. I wonder how many presidents it will send if one day it has to face God. Last point, political segmentation. Now, this is where the evidence from the case studies is weakest, and where I strongly rely on what I read in Grande Crisis and Hutter's paper. Now, the first observation is that the integration of core state powers is associated with politicization. So there's media attention, there's debate, there's contestation. You know, the European integration started, you know, with a big bang in 1954 when the European defense community failed to come about. So there was a lot of publicity. Then it moved into market integration, and attention tended to go down, but flaring up occasionally. But, you know, with the move back into core state powers since the early 1990s, it has again become more controversial, the EU. Now, of course, there's variance across core state powers. Public administration doesn't draw any attention, any debate at all. So that is an integration that is completely by stealth. But of course, there's also variance across the mode of integration. So whenever the issue is the creation of European capacity, there's a lot of debate. And why is that? Because the creation of European capacity creates what Grandehutter and Crisi call a constitutional, what was it, moment or issue. It raises constitutional issues about, you know, the allocation of powers between the EU and the member states, and immediately raises distributive conflicts and raises considerations of sovereignty. Regulation, of course, tends to dampen publicity because formally, you know, regulations impose the same rules on all. Therefore, they are more egalitarian on the surface, and they don't involve any change in the allocation of powers across levels. So finally, and then I stop, the result of the politicization associated with the integration of core state powers is to reinforce international cleavages between the member states. As Grando, Hutta, and Creasy have explained yesterday, the dominant cleavage in the EU is territorially defined. Well, others have said so before, but you know, that's the dominant line of conflict. The integration of core state powers contributes to that. And one last remark on you know, this primary line of conflict and the secondary line of conflict between Eurosceptic parties and mainstream parties. I think this primary territorial conflict superimposes itself on this secondary conflict, because the reason why we have a Eurosceptic party in Germany now, the AfD, is the Eurosceptic party in Greece, Syriza. So they are both Eurosceptic, but their Euroscepticism reflects their differences in national position. Okay, on this happy note, let me close. Thank you.